In the rolling hills of Massachusetts, beneath a weathered headstone that few ever notice, lies a man whose courage at Bunker Hill was so extraordinary. 14 of his fellow soldiers broke military protocol to petition their government on his behalf. His name was Salem Poor, a brave and gallant soldier by those who fought beside him. Most Americans have never heard his story. Across the nation, in Brooklyn's industrial streets, the bones of nearly 300 Maryland heroes rest forgotten. Under parking lots and auto shops, their sacrifice having saved George Washington's entire army from annihilation. And in the valleys of New York, the descendants of Oneida warriors still keep sacred the memory of their ancestors, who were America's first allies, yet whose names appear on no monuments in our capital. These are the forgotten warriors of the American Revolution, men and women whose blood, sweat, and sacrifice forged a nation, yet whose stories have been buried beneath centuries of silence. While marble statues honor the familiar faces of Washington, Franklin, and Hamilton, thousands of equally heroic Americans remain nameless, their deeds unsung, their courage unremembered. Tonight, we're going to change that. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about who really won the American Revolution. This isn't the sanitized story you learned in school about powdered wigs and polite gentlemen signing documents. This is the raw, untold saga of enslaved people who fought for freedom while still in chains, of women who disguised themselves as men to charge into battle, of Native Americans who chose sides in a war that would ultimately destroy their world, and of immigrants who bled for a country that barely considered them citizens. The American Revolution wasn't won by the famous names carved into monuments. It was won by farmers who left their plows, by fishermen who became Navy commanders, by teenagers who lied about their age to carry muskets, and by mothers who melted down their pewter plates to make bullets. These forgotten warriors came from every corner of society, united only by their willingness to risk everything, for an idea that had never been tried before in human history. But here's what makes their story even more remarkable. Many of these heroes were fighting not just for American independence, but for their own personal freedom. Enslaved African Americans who served 4 times longer than the average white soldier, knowing they might never see liberty themselves. Native American tribes who allied with the Continental Army, even as they watched their ancestral lands being carved up by the very people they were helping. Women who abandoned the safety of their homes to march alongside men. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why the revolution succeeded against impossible odds. It wasn't superior strategy or better equipment that defeated the most powerful empire on earth. It was the desperate courage of people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. People whose names should be carved in marble alongside the founding fathers, but instead lie forgotten in unmarked graves and faded military records. Let's begin with a man who embodied everything the revolution stood for, yet whose heroism has been erased from our national memory. Salem Poor was born into slavery in Massachusetts, but by 1775, he had purchased his own freedom and chosen to fight for his country's liberty. When the British marched toward Breed's Hill on that scorching June morning, Poor stood in the American lines, with his musket ready to face the most disciplined army in the world. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, if anyone remembered to tell it. As wave after wave of British soldiers climbed that hill, their redcoats blazing in the summer Sunday, Poor's rifle found its mark again and again. Witnesses later claimed he single-handedly killed British Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie, along with several other enemy soldiers. But it wasn't just his marksmanship that impressed his fellow soldiers. It was his leadership under fire, his calm commands in the chaos of battle, and his refusal to break. When the smoke cleared and the British had retreated, leaving hundreds of their dead scattered across the hillside, 14 white officers did something unprecedented in colonial America. They sat down and wrote a formal petition to the Massachusetts legislature, asking that Salem Poor be recognized for his extraordinary courage. In their own words, they called him a brave and gallant soldier who behaved like an experienced officer. This wasn't just a pat on the back. This was a formal military commendation, signed by men who risked their own reputations to honor a former slave. Poor didn't stop there. He re-enlisted multiple times, fighting at Saratoga, where Burgoyne's army surrendered, and at Monmouth, where Washington proved his army could stand toe-to-toe. with British regulars. He served longer and fought harder than most of his white counterparts, driven by a vision of freedom. That meant more to him than life itself. Yet today, you won't find Salem Poor's name on any monument in Boston. No statue commemorates the man whose courage inspired his fellow soldiers to break the racial barriers of their time. Poor represents just one of roughly 9,000 African Americans who chose to fight for the Continental Army, making up 4% of all Patriot forces. But here's the staggering reality that history books rarely mention. The average African American soldier served 4.5 years during the Revolution, 8 times longer than the typical white soldier. Think about what that means. While white farmers could return home for planting season and white merchants could tend to their businesses, Black Patriots stayed in the field year after year, through the brutal winter at Valley Forge, through the sweltering Southern campaigns, through defeats and victories alike. These men fought in every major battle of the war. At Lexington and Concord, at least 35 Black Patriots faced the British, with Prince Estabrook becoming one of the first Americans wounded. They stood in the ranks at Bunker Hill, charged across the Delaware with Washington, and endured the siege of Yorktown. Their blood soaked the same battlefields as their white comrades. Their bodies fell to the same British bullets, and their sacrifice secured the same liberty that would be denied to most of them for generations to come. But the tragedy of their forgotten sacrifice goes deeper than mere historical oversight. After the war ended, most of these black veterans were denied the pensions promised to other Continental soldiers. They died in poverty and obscurity, their service records lost or deliberately destroyed, their families left to struggle. Without the benefits earned through years of military service, the nation they helped create turned its back on them, erasing their contributions from the official narrative of American independence. The cruel irony wasn't lost on them. They had fought for a revolution that proclaimed all men were created equal, while knowing that equality was something they might never live to see. Yet they served anyway, motivated by a hope that their sacrifice might secure freedom for their children, or their children's children. They carried muskets for a republic that wouldn't acknowledge their humanity, charged into battle for officers who legally owned other human beings, and bled for a constitution that would count them as 3/5 of a person. Their forgotten heroism reveals the revolution's greatest contradiction and its most profound truth. The contradiction was obvious. How could a nation founded on liberty tolerate slavery? How could men fighting for freedom deny that same freedom to others? But the profound truth was that the ideals they fought for were bigger than the prejudices of their time. The words they died defending, that all men are created equal, would eventually be used to tear down the very system that enslaved them. Salem Poor and his fellow Black Patriots didn't just fight for American independence, they planted the seeds of their own emancipation, proving through their courage and sacrifice that the Revolution's promises applied to them too. Their forgotten valor would inspire future generations of freedom fighters, from the abolitionists who ended slavery, to the civil rights leaders who finally fulfilled the Revolution's promise of equality. But their story is just the beginning. Across the frozen waters of the Delaware River, another group of forgotten heroes was about to change the course of the war, with skills learned not on battlefields, but on the storm-tossed seas of New England. The wind howled across the frozen Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776. Ice chunks the size of carriages crashed against each other in the churning black water, while snow fell so thick that men couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. Any sane military commander would have called off the crossing. The river was a death trap, the weather was hellish, and the boats were completely inadequate for the task ahead. But George Washington wasn't dealing with ordinary circumstances, and he wasn't depending on ordinary men. Standing beside him on that treacherous riverbank was a weather-beaten sea captain from Massachusetts, whose calloused hands had guided fishing boats through storms that would have terrified admirals. John Glover looked at the ice-choked Delaware and saw not an impossible barrier, but just another day's work for a Marblehead fisherman. Behind him stood his regiment of sailors, men whose faces were carved by salt spray and whose muscles were hardened by hauling nets in North Atlantic gales. They were about to save the American Revolution, and most people today have never heard their names. Glover's story began in the fishing villages of Massachusetts, where survival depended on reading wind and weather. on knowing exactly how much weight a boat could carry, and on making life or death decisions in seconds. These weren't gentlemen soldiers trained in European military academies. These were working men, who understood that when the sea wanted to kill you, technique mattered more than courage, and experience trumped bravery every time. When the war began, Glover organized his fellow fishermen into a regiment unlike any other in the Continental Army. They marched in loose formation, spoke in sailors' slang that baffled their officers, and looked nothing like proper soldiers. Their uniforms were patched with canvas, their weapons were often their own fishing knives and maritime tools, and they moved with the rolling gait of men more comfortable on deck than on land. Other regiments mocked them as waterfront rabble. Washington saw them as the answer to his prayers. The first time Glover proved his worth was during the disaster at Brooklyn Heights. British forces had trapped Washington's entire army on Long Island, with their backs to the East River and nowhere to retreat. It was a death sentence. 20,000 Continental soldiers were about to be captured or killed, ending the revolution before it truly began. But on that foggy night in August, while British campfires twinkled just miles away, Glover's Marbleheaders began ferrying the entire American army across treacherous waters in complete silence. For 9 hours, they rowed back and forth through the darkness, loading boat after boat with soldiers, horses, cannons, and supplies. Not a single man was lost to the river, not one boat capsized, and not one British sentry heard them, coming or going. When dawn broke and the fog lifted, British commanders stared in amazement at empty American fortifications. An entire army had vanished like ghosts, spirited away by fishermen who turned an impossible retreat into a masterpiece of military logistics. But Brooklyn was just the beginning. When Washington needed to cross the ice-choked Delaware for his surprise attack on Trenton, every other regiment declared it impossible. The boats were too small, the ice too thick, the weather too savage. Glover studied the river for 10 minutes, spat into the churning water, and told Washington his men would get the army across. It would take all night, he warned, and they'd lose some boats to the ice, but it could be done. What followed was an epic of seamanship that saved American independence. While other soldiers huddled in their coats and wondered if they'd live to see morning, the Marbleheaders worked like demons in the howling wind. They poled their boats through ice floes that could crush a man's skull, navigated by instinct when snow made visibility impossible, and kept their vessels steady. While horses panicked and cannons shifted with each wave, Henry Knox's artillery pieces, each weighing thousands of pounds, had to be loaded with mathematical precision to prevent the boats from capsizing. Glover's men calculated weight distribution, like their lives depended on it, because they did. One miscalculation, one moment of carelessness, and Washington's army would be feeding the fish. At the bottom of the Delaware, hour after hour, boat after boat, they ferried 2,400 soldiers and 18 artillery pieces. Across that frozen hell, men's hands froze to their oars, ice formed in their beards, and their clothes turned rigid as armor. But they never stopped rowing. When officers complained about the cold, the Marbleheaders just laughed and told stories about winter fishing trips that made this crossing look like a pleasure cruise. By dawn, the impossible had been accomplished. Washington's army stood on the New Jersey shore, cold but intact, ready to march on Trenton. The Hessian garrison they surprised had been celebrating Christmas with generous amounts of alcohol, never imagining that anyone could cross the Delaware in such conditions. The victory that followed wasn't just a tactical success. It was proof that the Continental Army could still fight, still win, still shock the world's most powerful military. But here's what makes Glover's achievement even more remarkable. This was the third time he had saved Washington's army, through pure seamanship and courage. After Brooklyn and the Delaware, he would continue serving wherever boats and bad weather created impossible challenges. His Marbleheaders became Washington's go-to regiment for amphibious operations, river crossings, and any mission that required men, who understood that the difference between success and disaster often came down to reading the wind correctly. These forgotten heroes didn't fight for glory or recognition. They were practical men who solved practical problems, and their reward was knowing they'd done their job well. When the war ended, most of them went back to their fishing boats, and their nets, never bothering to write memoirs or demand monuments. Their heroism was quiet, technical, and absolutely essential. Yet try to find John Glover's name on any monument in Washington, D.C. Try to locate a statue commemorating the Marbleheaders, who saved the Continental Army 3 separate times. You'll search in vain, because their kind of heroism doesn't translate well to marble and bronze. They were the men who made famous victories possible, the unsung professionals who turned desperate gambles into legendary triumphs. Their story reveals something profound about the Revolution that gets lost in our myths about gentlemen soldiers and noble causes. The war was won by people who were very good at their jobs, who brought specialized skills to impossible situations, and who understood that survival often depended on knowledge gained through years of hard, dangerous work. Glover and his Marbleheaders weren't fighting for abstract principles of liberty and democracy. They were fighting because their country needed them to do what they did best, and they were too proud and too professional to do anything less than their absolute best. Their forgotten sacrifice reminds us that revolutions succeed not just because of grand gestures and stirring speeches, but because ordinary people with extraordinary skills show up when everything depends on getting the job done right. But while Glover's men were mastering the waters of the Northern Theater, another group of forgotten warriors was preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice. On the blood-soaked fields of Brooklyn, the morning of August 27th, 1776 dawned grey and humid over Long Island, with British ships darkening the harbor like storm clouds gathering for the tempest of a lifetime. Lord Cornwallis had landed with the most powerful invasion force ever assembled in North America, 25,000 professional soldiers, backed by the Royal Navy's thundering guns. Against this overwhelming tide stood Washington's ragtag Continental Army, outnumbered 3-1 and trapped with their backs to the East River. It should have been a massacre. That ended the revolution in a single afternoon. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most heroic last stands in American history, performed by men whose names have been buried beneath Brooklyn's streets for over 2 centuries. The Maryland 400 marched into that hell knowing they would never march out again. These weren't desperate conscripts or untrained militia. They were gentlemen soldiers, men of honor and fortune who had volunteered to fight for American independence when they could have easily purchased their way out of service. They came from Baltimore's finest families, owned prosperous businesses, and possessed everything the Revolution promised to protect. Yet when Washington needed someone to hold back the British tide, long enough for his army to escape, they stepped forward without hesitation. Major Mordecai Gist led them toward the Vechte-Cortelyou House, a stone mansion that British forces had converted into a fortress, bristling with cannons and muskets. The tactical situation was hopeless. 400 Americans were about to assault a fortified position, defended by over 2,000 British regulars, with no artillery support, no possibility of reinforcement, and no chance of survival. Military textbooks would call it suicide. The Marylanders called it their duty. What followed defied every principle of 18th century warfare. Instead of a single desperate charge, Gist ordered attack after attack, wave after wave of Maryland soldiers hurling themselves against British steel and lead. Each assault bought precious minutes. For Washington's main force to retreat toward the Brooklyn Heights fortifications, each charge cost dozens of American lives, but kept thousands more from being captured or killed in the chaos of a general rout. The British defenders watched in amazement as men they had already defeated refused to stay defeated. Cornwallis himself later described the Maryland charges as the most determined resistance he had ever witnessed, praising enemies who fought with a fury that bordered on madness. These weren't professional soldiers following orders from distant commanders. These were patriots who understood that their deaths might purchase their country's survival. The carnage was beyond description. British grapeshot tore through Maryland ranks like a scythe through wheat. Bayonets found flesh, sabers, split skulls, and musket balls shattered bones with sickening regularity. The stone house became a slaughter pen where American bodies piled 3 deep, their blood soaking into Long Island soil that would never forget their sacrifice. But they kept coming. Every time the British thought they had broken the American attack, another line of Maryland soldiers emerged from the smoke, stepping over the corpses of their comrades to press the assault. Some carried their wounded friends on their backs, refusing to abandon them to British mercy. Others fought on with shattered arms and gaping wounds, sustained by nothing more than stubborn courage and love of country. Major Gist found himself in the surreal position of ordering his own friends to their deaths. Men he had grown up with, shared drinks with, stood as best man at their weddings, now looked to him for commands that would send them into eternity. He gave those orders anyway because he understood what they understood. If the Maryland 400 could hold this ground for just one more hour, just one more charge, Washington's army might live to fight another day. The mathematics of sacrifice were brutal and precise. For every minute the Marylanders delayed the British advance, hundreds of Continental soldiers moved closer to the safety of Brooklyn Heights. For every Maryland life lost at the Stone House, dozens of American lives were saved at the river crossing. It was a transaction written in blood and measured in heartbeats, with no room for sentiment or second thoughts. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the Maryland ranks grew thinner. Companies that had marched into battle with 50 men now counted their survivors on one hand. Officers who had led charges at dawn were carried away on stretchers or left motionless in the grass. The regimental colors, torn by grape shot and stained with blood, still flew above the diminishing band of survivors, who refused to acknowledge defeat. The final charge came near sunset, when barely 100 Marylanders remained capable of fighting. They had been battling for over 6 hours, without food, without water, without hope of reinforcement or rescue. Their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Their weapons were fouled with powder residue and gore, and their bodies were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Yet when Gist called for one last assault, they formed ranks as if they were fresh troops, beginning their first engagement. This time, they never made it to the Stone House. British fire cut them down in the open field, their bodies falling like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Major Gist survived, along with perhaps 9 other Maryland soldiers. Out of the original 400, the rest lay scattered across Brooklyn's fields, their sacrifice complete, their duty fulfilled. But their deaths had accomplished exactly what they intended. While the Maryland 400 held the British at the Stone House, Washington's main army completed its withdrawal to Brooklyn Heights. 8,000 American soldiers who might have been captured or killed in the retreat lived to fight another day, preserved by the blood of men who chose certain death over possible dishonor. The British buried the Maryland dead in mass graves scattered across the battlefield, marking their locations with crude wooden markers. That time and weather soon erased. Over the decades that followed, Brooklyn grew into a bustling industrial district. Streets were paved over the burial sites, factories were built on hallowed ground, and the exact locations of the Maryland graves were lost to urban development. Today, somewhere beneath a parking garage or an auto repair shop, the bones of America's first heroes rest in unmarked obscurity. A small weathered sign on a busy street corner mentions their sacrifice, but few pedestrians pause to read it. The Maryland 400 have been forgotten by the city they died defending, their mass grave transformed into a landscape of concrete and commerce. Their story reveals the Revolution's most painful truth about heroism and memory. The men who made ultimate sacrifices often receive the least recognition, while those who survive to write memoirs and build monuments claim the lion's share of historical glory. The Maryland 400 died too young to become famous, too completely to tell their own stories, too nobly to demand recognition they would never live to receive. Yet their forgotten valor echoes through every subsequent generation of American warriors. At Gettysburg and Normandy, at Iwo Jima and Khe Sanh, American soldiers have faced impossible odds. With the same stubborn courage that drove Maryland gentlemen to charge British cannons, the tradition of American sacrifice was born. On Brooklyn's fields, nurtured by men whose names we no longer remember but whose example we still follow, their legacy lives not in marble statues or bronze plaques, but in the simple fact that we remain free to gather, to speak, to choose our own leaders and shape our own destiny. Every right we exercise, every freedom we enjoy was purchased with the blood of forgotten warriors who believed that some causes are worth dying for, even if history forgets to remember their names. But while the Maryland 400 were making their final stand in Brooklyn, Another group of forgotten allies was preparing to risk everything for American independence in the forests of New York, where brother would fight brother in some of the Revolution's most brutal battles. These forgotten warriors remind us that true heroism rarely seeks recognition. Their courage forged our nation, yet their names remain uncarved in stone. Perhaps it's time we honor not just the famous founders, but the nameless patriots whose blood and sacrifice made our freedom possible.